Well, John, this is your office. Thank you for hosting us. Tell us a little bit about it, because politicians, they are known to be outside on the campaign trail, speaking to people, kissing babies, picking up puppies, all the usual stuff. But this is like the heart of where you are. So tell us about your office a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the office of the Leader of the Opposition in Parliament, located in the Marx Building. It used to be the Prime Minister's office until the building next door was built, and then the President also moved his office to Steenhuisen. So there's a lot of history in this office. I mean, Jan Smuts, Louis Botha, other Prime Ministers all sat in this office, and you sometimes feel the weight of history when you're working here. But it is really the engine room of the parliamentary operation, this wing here, so colloquially called the West Wing by our caucus. It locates the Leader's office, the Chief Whip's office, the Deputy Chief Whip's office, and their ancillary staff. And it's really the heartbeat of the parliamentary operation of the party. And it's a great place to work, and it's a great place to come in to be able to sit in an office like this and you have meetings and meet ambassadors, meet your caucus members, and discuss strategy. And I regard it as a huge honour to be able to work in an office like this.
So what famous people have you met in this office?
I met Peter Mandelson in this office, not a romance friend, but he did teach me one important thing. He said, if you can get people to laugh at your opponents, you've won 50% of the battle. I've met most of the ambassadors and consul generals of the main countries, United States, Great Britain, etc. here. And then, of course, lots of famous local people, Helen Ziller, and others. So it's mainly used for the sort of the more formal high level meet and greets with individuals, and then obviously if you need to host a meeting of key stakeholders as well, it's also a useful place.
So earlier you took us for a little tour around here, and we met Siviwe, who is the new Chief Whip of the DA. She's got a much nicer office than you, if I may say so myself. How important is your relationship with the Chief Whip? First of all, what does she do, and how important is it that you are able to see people in the same physical space? Because now we've got to work from home and all that nonsense, which is useful sometimes, but I think for you it might not be at all.
No, it's not. And I mean, politics, as I've said many times, is a contact sport. You need to have contact with people, with your opponents, with your allies, with colleagues. And that's why we're fighting very hard to get Parliament to come back. You're right, it is a nice office, and it used to be my office when I was the Chief Whip. And I did toy with the idea of turning that into the Leader's office when I became the parliamentary leader. But was persuaded otherwise that this is really the official Leader of the Opposition's office. And so I'm here now, but I have great memories of that office and my time as Chief Whip. It's obviously very important to have a good relationship with your Chief Whip, which is why the position is an appointed one in the discretion of the Leader. The Leader chooses who he would like as his Chief Whip, and he appoints and disappoints those incumbents. I think that Siviwe and I have got a great working relationship. We've worked together over many, many years. And I think that she brings an energy and dynamism to that particular role, which I think is incredibly helpful for the DA. It also means that when I'm away on the campaign trail or out doing other events, that there's a solid, stable force here in Parliament that's able to lead the caucus. So we meet regularly, we speak regularly, and we obviously consult on the key decisions that are required to be made in leading a caucus as of 112 people here in Parliament. And it's no easy task, and the Chief Whip's job is incredibly important. So for most people don't understand it, it's in business terms, I would either be the CEO or the chairman of the board. The Chief Whip is the COO, the operations officer. They take the party policy and direction and that is agreed to, and they go and make sure it's being implemented. The Chief Whip's also responsible for discipline and making sure that members of Parliament are attending their committees, that they're attending to their constituency duties, and that they are driving the issues that we've identified in our strategy committee and within the caucus as the important ones.
So if I look around your office, there's a lot of John F. Kennedy memorabilia. You've got a picture of John F. Kennedy on the wall, and there's a couple of books here. What's the fascination with John F.?
I just really liked, both Kennedy brothers when I was starting out in politics particularly. And I think what I liked about them, they're probably far too left for Raman's liking. So as he's vigorously shaking his head. But what I really liked about them was they brought a new energy and dynamism to politics. And if one looks at the staid post Second World War political environment, I thought there was a young, fresh voice, and also a voice that didn't pander to a particular group of supporters. Or I think that's lazy politics, to be able to just find a group of aggrieved people and pander to them. And I think what he did was challenged even his own supporters to think beyond their own narrow interests. So the start around the whole civil rights movement and the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, which was to go on and cost his party, the South, for a generation and more. He did it because he felt it was the right thing to do, and it would have been easy to pander to the Democrats in the South, but he didn't. He went out and challenged them for a better future, more inclusive future in America.
For the audience, I think you need to understand the KKK were a branch of the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. And JFK was the one who changed that.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, also the Republican Party was the party that freed the slaves under Lincoln. So I think it shows how political movements do change, and political philosophies are not set in stone, and that they do move, and political parties move with them.
Well, except in South Africa, though, because it seems that the political framework is not stale, maybe that's the wrong word, but I think it's so well designated about who's going to say what or who's going to act on what regard. But saying that, we need Parliament, as you mentioned earlier, to move the needle somewhere. But when we walked around earlier, it was bizarrely empty for the chief legislating powers of the country to be so empty. If you really don't like democracy, it might be great, but for someone who might want to change the country or to improve it somehow, it's a bit of a shame that Parliament's so empty.
Yeah, it's a real shame, and it's been like this since the beginning of COVID. And it's now been exacerbated by the fire that took place in Parliament, which destroyed the sort of central meeting point of Parliament. And it's been to a fact where most MPs actually don't come into Parliament. There's some MPs I haven't seen on this precinct for almost 2 years. And I think it is a shame. I think that politics is better served when people are coming together and meeting each other and exchanging ideas and exchanging views. The online platform, I think, is a wholly inappropriate substitute for that. But unfortunately, there's a lot of MPs, and particularly in the governing party, who've got very used to staying at home and just putting on a computer and letting it play in the corner of the room while they go about their other business, or even shopping at Foschini or having your nails done at a beauty salon, as many of the hot camera moments have exposed over the course of the last while. And so I think it's a real shame that the hustle and bustle of this precinct has gone. And it's a real shame that Parliament has not, since January, got up and found a decent venue where the 400 members of Parliament can come together and do the people's business as they're expected to do. How do you say you're actively applying your mind to a piece of legislation or interrogating an official or a minister when it's the huge gap of the digital divide exists between the two of you? And I think it's become far too convenient for members of Parliament not to be here on the precinct Monday to Friday and to stay in their own homes doing political work. But I think the real people that have been robbed are the tax-paying citizens of the country who have MPs who I think have been reduced to part-time work.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of see, anybody who's ever run a business knows that when your members of staff are not in work and they're working from home, it takes an incredible amount of discipline to actually be disciplined enough to log on every day and actually do your X amount of hours. So I suppose in that context, applying that same logic, you would assume, even for some of the MPs, they may not have that discipline. It's much easier, just as you rightly say, put the laptop on and let it run, and then just say to the party, which we discussed earlier, oh, my vote is whatever you say my vote is. I let it run in the background so I'm logged on, but I actually don't really know what my name's going to.
And also, you don't know where you are. I mean, you can log in from a cell phone, for instance. So you could be in the middle of a game reserve, or you could be in the middle of a nightclub, or driving in your car somewhere, and you log in. How are you applying your mind to A, the debate, and B, technical things like legislation, which is one of the key constitutional instructions that we're supposed to perform as Parliament. How can you be going clause by clause through a piece of legislation when you're looking after kids, or you're at the salon or the like? And I think the citizens of South Africa are being robbed of a proper legislative and deliberative process through this. I think the last Parliament in the world that is still meeting virtually. Even parliaments in disaster-ravaged countries, war-ravaged countries, even the Ukrainian parliament is meeting in person. The Rada is meeting in person to have sessions and to have debates, etc. But we just can't seem to get our act together here. And we've got a speaker as well who comes from a very strong executive tradition and who doesn't really regard the work of Parliament as very important.
So earlier we had lunch, a heavily subsidised lunch. So thank you, taxpayer. It was very delicious. But how does Parliament actually work? Let's assume, for example, all the members are here Monday to Thursday. What we see in the National Chamber, or whatever you call it, the National Assembly, where people fight with each other and you call each other Teletubbies or whatever. I still remember that speech, it was great. But what is the working environment with MPs from the different parties while you are off camera or out of that chamber? Is it a lot more friendly than one might expect, or how does it work?
Yeah, I think it is a lot more friendly. I think you've got a bunch of people that are thrust together from outside of their provinces, outside of their homes, here in Cape Town for 5 days. And I think that off camera, there's a lot more collegiality and to and fro and finding of each other than there is necessarily in the confrontational arena that is the National Assembly. And a place like Parliament cannot work if there's a perpetual state of confrontation. There has to be compromise, give and take, discussions going on behind the scenes about how we make this place work. And I think that is also robbed by the fact that MPs are not here physically, interacting with each other, looking at each other eyeball to eyeball, meeting over a drink in Barney's afterwards, meeting over your heavily subsidised lunch at downstairs in the dining room. And I think all of those points of contact are no longer here. And I think it's also leading to a far more partisan stance in Parliament, where parties are far more rigid in their particular approaches on things, whereas had you been able to have an opportunity to meet in the corridors, have a quick meeting in one of the offices, meet over that drink to discuss something, I think that the process is poorer because of it.
So I suppose just to give our own viewers a bit of an understanding, the general assumption will be you as leader of the opposition and say Juju, which is the most vocal party in Parliament, all raising their points of order. But the idea, I suppose, in most of our minds is that when you leave Parliament, you have punch-up. What's your relationship with those other leaders?
Well, I mean, with the other leaders, there are elements where you seek out each other's support on certain aspects, particularly when you're trying to prevent the abuse of power by the ANC. And so there are times when we do sit down with parties like the EFF and the ACDP, COPE, the UDM, to discuss how we're going to make sure that Parliament does its job. The most recent example is the work around the Section 89 committee, the impeachment process, the motions of no confidence, and our request to create an ad hoc committee. There is a degree of cooperation. I wouldn't say I'm particularly close to Mr. Malema and Juju, or whatever people like to call him, but there has to be some form of contact with those parties where we have a mutual interest. And that's not to say, I mean, we don't agree with everything that they do or say, and quite often we're diametrically opposed to them. But on those areas where you can find cooperation, I think it does send a stronger message when the opposition is standing together on an item. I think that sends out a very big signal that it's not just one party, that there's multiple parties. And so we are trying to meet more regularly in Parliament as the opposition, the genuine opposition, because you get some of the opposition parties that are actually franchises of the ANC, parties like Good, Al Jamaa, and others who are simply the ANC in drag, and they will do whatever the ANC tells them to do because they rely on the largesse of the ANC for positions and patronage. But we are trying to get together more regularly as the opposition and work at how we can help each other to be able to achieve greater accountability in the House.
And I suppose it's that cooperation that freaks people out, because they see you cooperating with someone like the EFF and they go, so what are you, EFF now?
You're on the same team.
You're on the same team.
But I mean, it's an issue by issue basis. I mean, I believe the EFF are the antithesis of what the DA stands for. I mean, it's the open opportunity society versus the closed crony society, and the Chavez-style policies are markedly different to ours. And we voted against the EFF proposals on expropriation without compensation and nationalisation of the Reserve Bank, and now on the latest one to try and move Parliament to Pretoria. We will not see eye to eye on that, but where there are areas of cooperation, it's not a coalition. It's not like you want to sign a coalition agreement with people, but where your interests merge and match, it makes sense to be able to try and then work with each other to achieve that common objective. It doesn't mean that I'm going to don a red overall and come in with a hard hat to Parliament the next day.
That's a shame. Because you used to one in a blue overall.
Well, I'll consider it, but I'll probably look like rather rotund Bob the Builder.
And for you personally, the difference between being a chief whip and being an actual leader, what are the market difference that you've realized? I mean, you became leader almost 2 years now, I believe. Is there a huge difference in terms of what?
There's a huge difference, and the two roles are very different. I mean, the chief whip is generally a Rottweiler who goes in and really is the bad cop to try and get the rules enforced and get things done, on bully stuff onto the program, shame the other parties into assisting to get stuff done. So I think there's a much harder, rougher edge to being chief whip than there is to being the leader. The leader of the opposition, particularly, you're expected to be a bit more decorous in the House and to be a little less confrontational when it comes to some of the other parties, and to try and build a consensus amongst the opposition. So there is a few softer edges to being the leader than there are to being the chief whip.
Is that tough for you?
It is very tough for me.
Really?
I'm a political street fighter. I mean, I'm a political street fighter. I really like the rough and tumble of politics, and I really loved being the chief whip in Parliament. It's one of the best jobs in Parliament. But when your leader walks off the job and throws the banner on the floor, on the dirt, and then walks all over it, what do? You've got to pick it up and hold it aloft again and advance it. And so the time called for that to happen, and I'm enjoying it. I think I'm growing into the role. I don't think it's a role that you are naturally born to. I think there's a lot of experience that you have to go through to get to it. I think I'm getting there. I still miss the hurly-burly of the House, and I'm very jealous sometimes of the chief whip getting up to really do the street fighting. But there's a time and place, and I think this is the role that I'll be performing now is going to be very important for the DA, particularly going into the next election.
So obviously that when you became leader of the opposition, you held a policy conference, and one of the key things you got, or you mandated, was non-racialism. How do you personally respond to all the criticism that you get as a white male running a political party in South Africa, the official opposition? Everybody goes, oh, that would never work. Like, he needs to be a black person of some variety because that's the only way to get elected here. What's your response to that?
Well, I think that with that criticism, it's that old saying, those who matter don't mind and those who mind don't matter. The reality is that no matter who the DA's got in as the leader, it's never going to be good enough. I mean, when we had Helen, everyone said you need a black leader. When we had Musi, everyone said, well, he's not black enough. And you get all this nonsense. So my answer to them is simply this: I didn't choose the colour I came out. There's not a self-select button on the way out, to say, how you come into this world. Yes, I'm a white South African. I've got a contribution to make. Judge me on that contribution. Don't judge me on the fact that I'm happen to be a certain skin colour. And I think that Helen Suzman proved that very effectively. There was no bigger voice in the established parliament at that time for black political prisoners on Robben Island than Helen Suzman. She didn't need to be a black political prisoner on Robben Island to stand up for black political prisoners. And I think she was very good at highlighting the treatment. I don't think that I need to be a poor black South African to stand up for the rights and future of poor black South Africans, and that we should rather judge people on their merits and what they achieve and what they say, rather than just simply discarding them because they happen to be a certain skin color. I think that is the worst form of tokenism that you can have. It's also reflected in the votes. We had a black leader, and it was the DA's worst election result since 1994. So I think that the political chattering class and the talking heads and the commentariat, particularly in the lamestream media, very are obsessed about it far more than voters are. And then, in fact, the majority, and certainly IRR's polling proves it, that the majority of South Africans actually believe in non-racialism and don't really care about the color of the person as long as the services are being delivered, the jobs are being created, and their lives are improving.
So two final questions from me, but which are related. Number one, what do you want your legacy to be once you leave the job of leader? And B, I think that is the legacy is connected to 2024. Like, what would a win look like for you?
Yeah. So a win for me from our first term was to stabilize the DA. There's very few parties in the world that survive a leader just walking off the job and throwing the banner on the floor and leading a walkout with several other people. And it was a big job to stabilize the DA. I mean, we dropped down to around about 12% in our polling, which was horrific after that. And it took blood, sweat, and tears from a lot of people to stabilize the ship. Well, I think the last election showed us that we've recovered. We did better than we did in 2019. And I believe we're now on the growth trajectory. So I want stability and growth. I would like the DA to be above 25% in this next election. I think that would be a respectable showing. Obviously, 30% would be great, but the reality is that even the recent polling in reports shows that we're just between 11 and 13% away from the ANC's share of the vote. Now, that gives us huge opportunity going forward. I think that the next election is going to come down to coalitions. I don't think there's any party that's going to get a majority. And let me tell you, between 25 and 30% is a very respectable pile of chips to put on the table to be able to be the heartbeat of any form of new realignment in politics or new majority in South Africa. So I would like to see the DA growing significantly in the next election. I believe we can do it. I think more and more South Africans are realizing that these small fly-by-night parties, these personality cults, actually don't ever go the distance, and that the tried and tested track record of getting things done is a party that you should really back, particularly going into what I believe is the last chance saloon election for South Africa. I think if the ANC prevail in this next election, I don't know what's going to be left in the election afterwards to be able to pick up and survive. Another 5 years even on the current trajectory, this failed state, poverty, hunger, economic exclusion on an even grander scale than we could possibly imagine. So we've got to save it. So I've called it the moonshot election for the party. We've got to throw everything we've got into the mission to be able to turn the ANC into a minority party and to then form the heart of a new, broader realignment of South African politics.
So my last question then is connected to that. 2024 comes in. John Steenhuisen, DA, they're in power. How many years do you need to fix it?
I think it's going to take at least 10 years to turn around the damage that has been done. There's going to have to be a significant realignment of the state, reduction in the size of government, the size of the civil service, the size of cabinet, getting government out of the way in a lot of key areas where you need the private sector to come in and bring its efficiencies and effectiveness. We've got to radically overhaul our electricity sector in South Africa. Eskom is the biggest threat on our balance sheet at the moment and the biggest threat to our economic future and growth. And then also we've got to reinvent the way we do things. We still police in a Victorian way. We still educate in a Victorian way. We've got to fundamentally reform both the way we fight crime and the way we teach our children to be prepared for the world that has moved on significantly. And those reforms will take, particularly the ones around education, I believe would take around 5 to 7 years to start yielding a result that you'd be able to see. It's been significant. I mean, 74 years of one-party domination has severely damaged South Africa's apparatus of state. And I think it's going to take a lot to turn it around. So I don't want anybody to be under some illusion that we get into power tomorrow and suddenly things are going to be all right. It's going to take a long haul to be able to get things right again in South Africa, and people are going to have to be patient. And there's going to be some tough austerity measures that are going to have to be implemented as well, which may not be popular with a lot of people, but for our future sustainability as a country are going to be absolutely essential. So it's not going to be popular to reduce the size of the civil service. There's many people who are going to say, well, you're retrenching large numbers of people. The reality is if we don't do it, it's going to continue to be a stumbling block to further growth and further job creation.
So are you going to encourage people to be patient? Because obviously you're seeing that already, even in places like Swana and Port Elizabeth, when you take Metro there, like everybody's like, okay, well, you're in power, but that pothole down my road didn't magically get fixed overnight with the new wand that you're waving. So how do you get people to keep the faith over the long haul while you're fixing?
So I think that you focus on getting some quick early runs on the scoreboard. Fix what needs to be done. And there's some relatively easy things you can do. You can get in and scrap state-owned entities and allow that vacuum to be filled by the private sector. You can get in and reduce the size of government, reduce the number of ministries. Get some of those easy runs on the board that show people these are the tangible changes that have happened. And then to be honest with people about what you're going to do. Which is why I far prefer to campaign, when I campaign, not on a set of promises, but a set of examples of what we've done where we govern. So our last election campaign was the DA gets things done. And we didn't go and paint a picture of what we want you to see. We showed you what we've done already in places where we govern. And I think it's about getting those early runs on the scoreboard, and it's being absolutely frank and honest with people about why there's a reason for the delay. So you need to tell voters why that pothole is not being fixed overnight, and that we will get to it, and to try and give them a realistic time frame to do it. But I think that's where many political parties go wrong. They make promises, they overpromise, and then they completely underdeliver. I think it's always better to underpromise and overdeliver, so that people are able to see that tangible result. And we don't always get it right. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, people mustn't think that for a moment that this DA is this shining example of perfection. We're not. We're a political party. We make mistakes. We're a party that's got humans in it that make errors of judgment. But I'd like to think that we learn from those, and that we don't repeat them, and that we go forward stronger and more determined as a result of those setbacks. And I hope that people see that we will always act in their best interests, not the best interests of the party, but the best interests of the people that have elected us to be able to get into government and do things that they would like to see happening to improve their lives.